So it says that host has disabled screen sharing, so I can't share my screen.
You should be able to now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, now you should see the full screen, right?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone, and thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I love seeing and being a part of other people's nature groups, so I really genuinely thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to give a little presentation on COSEWIC. And so my presentation is going to be quite technical, and I'm going to try and not be too technical, but full disclosure, I nerd out on this stuff. I just love it. I love learning about assessment criteria and doing more of it, and it's totally my jam. So if you have any questions at some point, you can either contact me later or put it in the chat. I don't even know if there is a chat, or ask questions later. So I'm hoping I've made this smooth enough that people should be able to follow along. So my ministry name has recently changed into a new Land, Water and Natural Resources. We used to be Ministry of Environment, but on April 1st, there was a reorg, and here we are. So just a brief outline, I'm going to give a bit of background on COSEWIC and the assessment process, talk about the criteria used to assess species at risk. Just as a mild tangent, we often get people saying, oh, I think they just make up this stuff. Well, it's not made up at all. It's quite debated, and quite there's criteria and decisions behind the assessments, and it can get, again, you can really nerd out on it. I've tried to pull together some recent prairie species that have been assessed to date, and I've included Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba in that assessment. And then just briefly some challenges. Like every process, there are pitfalls and challenges and data deficiencies, and some of the things that you can do as citizen scientists, as naturalists, to help contribute to species at risk, whether it's recovery or assessment. So what is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada? Well, it's an independent national science advisory body, and as Fran said, it was formed in 1977. And in 1994, mollusks and butterflies, moths, lichens, and mosses were included. Prior to that, it was mostly vertebrates. In 2000, an Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee was formed, recognizing that there is traditional knowledge that can contribute to the species status assessment through people that have been on the land for a long time and recognize patterns of change, and can contribute to this in ways that aren't Western science. In 2003, other arthropods were added. And then in 2003, it was also legally recognized as the scientific component or advice that gives advice to the federal minister to list species under that act. So COSEWIC is the science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge advice to the minister. And then the minister is the person who makes the legal decision to list a species under the act. And those are separate processes. So COSEWIC has 34 members right now, or 34 votes. There are 4 federal government departments or bodies that contribute to the species assessment. There are 13 provinces and territories, 4 non-government science representatives, and then most recently there were 2 early career scientists, 2 early career positions added to COSEWIC. There's 1 ATK or Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee vote, and then 10 Species Specialist Subcommittee votes. Now, although all those different entities represent 1 vote, there are up to 60 members on COSEWIC, because each jurisdiction can have up to 4 members, and each of the subcommittees has 2 co-chairs. So the Species Specialist Subcommittees, this is the list here. But you will notice once you go through that list, there are some omissions. And so for example, fungi aren't represented here, or other invertebrates like earthworms or sea sponges or corals. And so even though there's a subcommittee for each of these 10 different groups of species, those other species are still part of Canadian wildlife. And so if a species that it doesn't fall under one of these subcommittees needs to be assessed, a special committee is formed, and that committee looks at the species in question. And so in particular, sea stars and other species, often they do have data and they can be assessed. But one of the reasons why there aren't these other subcommittees is there just isn't the data out there to properly assess these species. But with time, those committees could be formed. So it's really important that people know that COSEWIC and their members are completely independent of any of the institutions, governments, or political sway. So they come to the table to assess the science and Aboriginal traditional knowledge that's presented for a species. And so even though each of the jurisdictions are from like BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, they don't represent those governments. And so it's not based on affiliation or socioeconomic consequence, or, for example, hunting regulations or something that would influence the decision. They're based on the best available scientific and ATK knowledge. And of course, you never know. There's always the pitfall of needing more information. So that's why it's the best available scientific community and Aboriginal traditional knowledge, because there's always more information that can be gathered. So to start the assessment process by COSEWIC, just to back up, COSEWIC has all of these voting members, but they also are supported by a secretariat staff at Environment Canada, and those staff members are dedicated to just supporting the committee and the processes that make it go. And it's a tremendous amount of work for that committee, and they are paid positions by Environment Canada. But all of the subcommittee members, especially the co-chairs, they're volunteer positions. So even though we all have day jobs, a lot of us do this outside of our day jobs and as volunteers. And except for the jurisdictional members and the federal government departments, they're actually employed by those organizations. So if you want to start assessing a species at risk and get it assessed nationally by COSEWIC, how do you start? So the first step is to identify the species for assessment. And so there are criteria associated with an extinction risk, and I'll get to that in a minute. The species is assessed at the national level, so something that's at risk in the entire part of Canada. And an example would be the great blue heron, for example, in British Columbia. It's all throughout the province, but in other jurisdictions, there's not very many of them. So a species can be quite high in numbers in one jurisdiction and low in another, but overall in Canada, the species is at risk, or trend data shows it's at risk. Other species are vary in only a handful of places, and so they're a lot, I'll say, easier to assess. Each year, there are approximately 15 new assessments completed, and that's due simply to resource limitations. There's only a certain budget and certain amount of work, certain amount of people available to do this work. So you've got new assessments, but you also have reassessments, because every 10 years, previously assessed species need to be reassessed again. So there's a constant wave of new species that need reassessments every year. And then the committee meets twice a year, so there is a bit of a limitation or a bottleneck when it comes to actually discussing and debating these species. But it does give you an idea of, with only 15, sometimes 20 new assessments per year, Canada has over 70,000 species. It's really hard to assess all of them. It's just resources and labor. So each subcommittee keeps a candidate species list, and these are grouped into a kind of general category of 1 to 3. And candidate lists are species that are potentially at risk in Canada. And each jurisdiction has a conservation data center or a natural heritage center that looks at species and prioritizes them for their at-risk status. And so from those separate jurisdictional entities, each subcommittee gets data downloads that help them decide what are highest in terms of priority for assessment at the national level. And so prioritization includes taxonomic level. For example, species are prioritized higher than subspecies or populations. What proportion of the global range is in Canada? Canada has a responsibility to the world. And so if there's a greater proportion of a global range of a species in the country, it's prioritized as a greater. Is there an existing conservation status rank already? So there are other entities that have looked at the conservation status of species at risk and different factors and made decisions or recommendations on those status. And so COSEWIC draws on that information. Is there trend data available that help evaluate whether a population is going up or down? And of course, what are the real threats to the species? Can those be assessed and looked at and quantified if possible? Often a species has a very small extent of occurrence, and often it's in places where people like to live. So there's been a lot of development or habitat change. And so looking at that is also important to prioritize things. And then of course, limiting biological factors. Some species only have a few babies. And if you're only having a few babies each year, it limits your population growth. So if you've got hunting or bycatch or other forms of other threats that prevent population from increasing, those added threats plus the limiting biological factors make you a higher priority for assessment. So after candidate lists are formed, there are different types of status reports. So most species that get assessed through COSEWIC are done through this candidate list process, and each subcommittee recommends a few candidates each year to have new status reports prepared. However, there are other ways that status reports get prepared too. And because COSEWIC only has a limited number of people around the table, it recognizes that, hey, there are other people in the country and the world that know more about species than who's around the table at COSEWIC. So people outside of the committee can request an assessment of species either with a status report hasn't been prepared, or there's a template for status reports. And as an outside individual, you can prepare what's called an unsolicited status report if you feel that a certain species isn't getting the attention it needs and needs to be assessed by COSEWIC. So just to recap, you can write a letter to COSEWIC explaining why a species needs assessment and is priority, or you can write the report yourself and submit it. So those are two mechanisms as a person outside of COSEWIC can help assess species at risk. COSEWIC also recognizes that sometimes there's emergency assessments. So this is where a threat to a species, usually in the form of a disease or something that is at imminent risk of being lost due to habitat loss. And so COSEWIC will assess a species under an emergency assessment. And so what happens in this case is an ad hoc committee is formed and a justification written. And sorry, I should have had a picture of a salmon or something there or a bat that's recently had an emergency assessment. But this allows the mechanism of assessment to come quicker. An emergency assessment is completed within a year. And what I haven't explained is that this whole status report preparation timeline takes approximately 4 years. From the time a species is recommended as a candidate, it gets voted on by the committee as yes, it is a candidate and it's a high priority. We definitely need a status report. And then the jurisdictions are given a year and a half to prepare information that will help with the status assessment. The status report is put out for bids so that people can bid on writing the report, as it's a fair process. The reports aren't direct awarded to certain people. They're put out for tender. And then the report itself takes 2 years and goes through three 3 reviews. So there's a lot of scrutiny put in and time put into these status reports. With an emergency assessment, it just means it gets to skip all of that, because if we don't do something now, the species could be lost from Canada, and taking too much time means it's at real risk and in risk an emergency assessment. So once you've gone through all of that candidate review process, advertising, jurisdictional review, eventually a status report gets prepared. And so there's a contents to a status report. It's a standardized template. And if you're really curious, you can go to the COSEWIC website and download the template and into a Word file and take a look at it yourself. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but all of these different categories are all part of what help inform the status criteria under which a species is assessed. So the one thing I will point out, though, is the designatable units. So a species is described taxonomically. It either comes in a published form, like a standard description with science, or it can be described or described as a designatable unit. And this recognizes that a wide-ranging species has different components of it that could be more at risk than others, because it's been separated over geological time and been able to evolve separately, even though it's under the same species umbrella. So a recent example is Western bumblebee. It was assessed as 2 designatable units, or actually 2 subspecies, and each of those units came out as a different designation. So yeah, I won't go over all those details. But there are different types of status reports, because sometimes a species needs to be reassessed, and because of the giant backlog that COSEWIC has and the time it takes to write all these updated new status reports, a shortened template is prepared, and it's called a status appraisalist summary. And so this is just a shorter form of a status report, and all it does is update the existing information and leave everything else as is. And it's for when a species is not likely to change categories. So a species that's already assessed endangered will likely be endangered again. And so this just updates the information of a few of the components, but not the entire status report. It takes less time, less resources, and theoretically less debate, but that's not always the case. Another form of status report is called a rapid review of classification. This too is even less or shorter than the status appraisal summary. And again, it allows a quick technical review of the criteria. And it's usually for species who are long extirpated. And so it just recognizes that the species has been assessed. American burying beetle is an example. It was long ago assessed as extirpated. Not much information has changed, or there's no information at all on the species. And so it's just quickly assessed under a rapid review. Finally, the last one that a species can be assessed under is using an addendum. And this is when a species is either likely to no longer be eligible for assessment. And by that, I mean, there's been a taxonomic change to the species and it's no longer considered a definable entity. A species becomes data deficient, and for example, once it was assessed when people thought there was just 1 or 2 sites where it's known from, and then since that time another 50 sites have been found, and so and as a result there's not enough data to assess it anymore. Even though more sites have been found, it's not known if it's at risk. There's even more sites it could still be found at when a species is extirpated, or unfortunately when it's extinct. So once a status report is prepared, whatever the 4 forms it could take, it's reviewed by all the range jurisdictions across Canada. So recovery teams, independent experts, wildlife management boards, ATK members, and the broader COSEWIC members as a whole. And it's reviewed twice. And then one more time, it comes to the larger group, COSEWIC group, who review the status report before they debate the species at a COSEWIC assessment meeting. And that's section 4 there. So species are debated at COSEWIC meetings twice per year, usually in late April and late November. Observers are welcome to COSEWIC meetings. They are open to anyone who wants to come. You do need to sign a confidentiality waiver, because all the discussions within the COSEWIC committee are held confidential. And then during those discussions, the status is voted on with a 2/3 majority vote. So with 34 members, sometimes you don't always get everybody able to come, but as a group, we vote, and it needs to be 2/3 majority. The assessment results and rationale are made public almost immediately after the meeting. But the status reports themselves, they take about 6 months until they're published. And that's because all the comments need to be incorporated. And then they also go for English, sight and hearing translation, and web translation. And then they're posted on the web. Finally, after all of that, and I do say that takes about 4 years, the status advice from the COSEWIC debates are given to the federal minister, and that is done at once per year. And the federal minister then takes a look, and his or her team takes a look at the socioeconomic implications of listing that species under the Species at Risk Act, and that's a whole other separate process that COSEWIC isn't involved in. So getting a bit further, after all of that, COSEWIC assesses species into one of these 7 categories. And so the species, under the Species at Risk Act, the 3 categories are that translate into recovery planning documents are, 4, are extirpated, endangered, threatened, and special concern. And so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the criteria that go into assessing species. And again, I'm super geeky on this stuff, so I hope I've done enough to help people understand. So COSEWIC looks at things using 2 types of criteria. There's qualitative criteria and quantitative criteria. So the quantitative criteria are the data supported criteria, and they support threatened species that come out with a threatened or endangered status. The qualitative criteria support extinct, extirpated, special concern, and data deficient species assessments. And so in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, just a little bit on the species that have been assessed to date. Up to May 2021, now that's last year, but like I said, it takes about 6 months for species to get through and posted. There's been 251 wildlife species assessed, and I've got wildlife in brackets because that includes designatable units. And wildlife refers to any species that's been assessed by COSEWIC. So plants, mosses, lichens, any of the species in those different specialist subcommittees. The first one assessed in the prairies was the wolverine in 1982. Came out special concern. And then most recently in 2021 in November, which isn't in that 251 tally, but there were 6 species assessed from the prairie provinces, all of them in Alberta. I believe it was a leopard frog and a few others. There are 2 extinct species, the passenger pigeon and Banff long-nosed dace, and then 2 extirpated, the black-footed ferret and the greater prairie chicken, and then 14 data deficient species. So those are species that there wasn't enough information to assess them, and so they're deemed data deficient. In the different categories, I've tried to condense this slide down into something that was easy-ish to read, but you can see in Saskatchewan, there's been about 155 species assessed to date, and then those are the different categories of where they've been assessed at. Most of them are in the endangered, threatened, special concern, and not at risk categories, which is good. That means that there was solid data to support their assessment, and COSEWIC made like one of the challenges is when before you start assessing a species, you're not quite sure if you have enough data to produce an outcome. And so, with our limited resources, we want to make sure that there's an assessment outcome so that that the data can support. Well, because there has been an outcome of endangered, threatened, special concern, or not at risk, that's good. If there were higher numbers of data deficient species, that would be it's still an outcome, but it's better when there's a tangible outcome. And here's a bit more on the breakdown. Again, this is a little more difficult to read, but I just tried to show which species and what SSCs that have been assessed just in Saskatchewan. And so you'll notice that marine fish, marine mammals, and lichens are missing from that list. No, there's been none of those species assessed in Saskatchewan. Shouldn't be too much of a surprise with the marine fish and marine mammals, but the lichens, I actually thought there may be a few. Anyways, I'll share this presentation with Kirsten and Fran, and then people can take a closer look at this later. All of this data is publicly available on the SARA Public Registry, and if you can fiddle around with the inputs and get different outputs that will help you, or if you're more curious on different species groups and what's been assessed, it's all publicly available. So how does COSEWIC assess species at risk? Well, they use, as I said, quantitative and qualitative assessment processes based on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature system. So that's the IUCN criteria. And those criteria are used globally. There's two different ways, two different assessment I guess I should say methodologies. There's NatureServe and there's IUCN, and COSEWIC uses IUCN. And there's 5 different numerical criteria, the A through E. And I'm going to briefly go over each of those and try and give some examples, and where possible, examples from Saskatchewan that will help illustrate this. So the first one is the A criteria, and this is a decline in the total number of mature individuals. And because I'm into insects and I'm co-chair of the Arthropods Committee, this is one of the most challenging criteria under which to assess an arthropod. And it's because we just don't have a lot of data. So I pulled out, there's different subcategories of the A criteria, but I pulled out this one, and it's an observed, estimated, inferred, or suspected reduction in the total number of mature individuals over the last 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is longer. And this is where the reduction or its causes may not have ceased, may not be understood, or may not be reversible. So you really have to think about this. There's a lot of loaded words in there. But again, with insects, especially wide-ranging species, this is really challenging. This criteria is much easier to use marine fish or whaling or birds. But for insects, it's a real challenge because there's just not national programs on insect data gathering. So as I've got here, A criteria, it really helps, is supported with breeding bird surveys, Christmas bird counts, bird atlases, fish counts, and historical harvest data. So a lot of the mammals, marine and terrestrial mammals, have been assessed using these methods, as well as the birds. These data require quantifiable declines. So you need to show that there's been a decline of 30 to 50% over the last 10 years or 3 generations. And of course, a lot of the species I just mentioned have a greater than 10-year assessment time frame, especially, for example, whales or some birds. You really need to know the threats and why a species is declining. And then again, a clear decline in habitat quality or quantity. But I've got 2 examples of arthropods that were assessed using the A criteria. The monarch butterfly has some really great data sets associated with the spatial area that its overwintering adult population resides in Mexico. And the spatial quantification of that overwintering habitat and its declines was shown to meet the A criteria. And this, under that criteria, is how the monarch has been assessed as endangered. The 9-spotted lady beetle as well was assessed in I think 2018 using museum and collection data, both historical and current, and then a relative abundance estimate allowed us to look at those declines and show that the species has declined almost to zero in some parts of the country. And that was enough information to have the committee members support the assessment as endangered. So these are just some other examples. The burrowing owl, the chestnut-colored longspur, gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, and western bumblebee were all assessed using the A criteria because there was enough data to support them. I have a thing for owls, and I think the longspur is quite beautiful too. So that's why I highlighted those species. But there are a lot of other birds in the prairies that have been assessed too. And just finally, this is an example of a bumblebee data set that was used to assess western bumblebee, as well as yellow-banded bumblebee, gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, and Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, and show that their declines, the A criteria was supported, and they're all declining significantly. I take that back, actually. Yellow-banded bumblebee was assessed as special concern, but the other three were assessed as either threatened or endangered. The second criteria used to assess species is when they have a small distribution range and immediate threats that show a decline, or there's a fluctuation in their numbers. And so this is a lot of arthropods, plants, mosses, and lichens get assessed using these criteria. And you can see the species extent of occurrence, or its range in Canada, is under 20,000 or under 5,000 kilometers. That's a very small spatial area. The index of area of occupancy refers to when all the species sites it's known from are mapped, and a 2 by 2 kilometer square is placed over each known occurrence. And this is an index. So it kind of equals, it kind of helps compare apples and oranges when a spatial index is placed over top. And then a species is assessed using their number of locations, but the word locations is kind of loaded. It's threat-based. So what that means is that a species could be known from 10 sites, and I'll use a butterfly, for example. So a butterfly is known from 10 sites within a certain spatial area. However, the threat of the spray of BTK to control gypsy moth could mean that the spray could be sprayed over all 10 sites. And so that threat means there's just one location, and that location refers to the threat of gypsy moth, to BTK to control gypsy moth. If BTK was sprayed at 10 different times of the year, at over 10 different spatial areas, there'd be 10 different locations. And this concept is a really hard thing to grasp. At least when I first started learning these criteria, it was really hard for me to understand. It could also be if a species is known from 10 different sites on 10 different landowners, whether it's federal, provincial, private. 10 different landowners could have 10 different ideas of how to manage that land. That means there's 10 different locations. And so again, often these are for species that are very habitat specific, or they're down to a low number of sites because of historical habitat loss or development. And so again, I'm just sort of repeating myself, but there's a very small and quantifiable home range, so you know exactly where it occurs. It has very specific habitats and number of sites. Butterfly that feeds on a specific host plant. That host plant is easily mapped and spatially identified. There's very clear threats to the species, whether it's habitat loss, invasive species encroachment, it's consumed, there's a disease. There's also a real decline in habitat quality and quantity. And quantity is can be measured, but quality is subjective. So there's quite a bit of wiggle room there. And then of course, B criteria relies heavily on museum specimens and museum input and data. So it's I'll just put a plug for museums in there. It's very important. Museum data is important to the assessment for all species, but particularly for this type of species. So numerous vascular plants, mosses, arthropods, lichens, and a lot of mollusks have been assessed this way. And two examples are the Pauschik skipperling and the alkaline wing nerved moss, both species in very limited places and assessed using the B criteria. The C criteria are for very small or restricted total populations. And you'll notice the population thresholds for mature individuals are either under 10,000 or under 2,500 individuals. And for arthropods in particular, this is really hard to assess. For a lot of species it is, because even birds, bird counts are indices, and arthropods especially. So these criteria aren't used very often. Sometimes they're used with vascular plants because they can be quantified, and the specific habitats where they're known to occur are very, very known. So I'll just say that these are hard criteria, and I'm not going to go too much into it other than to say Vernus flower moth was assessed using these criteria and showing it's got a low population. And I think that's kind of cool. It's one of the few arthropods that actually had data to support that assessment. The D criteria are for very, very small restricted Canadian population and ranges. And so again, the number of mature individuals is very small. And the species that comes to mind for these ones are often associated with thermal springs with just one host plant, and the host plant is in a very defined small area, like for example the Yucca moth complex, which is in southern Alberta, or there's hot spring snails that have a very limited data and population. For threatened D2, these are for species that are under 20 square kilometers or in range, or have a number of locations less than 5. So again, very, very small restricted range species, and recognizing they could wink out at any moment. But for example, they might be within protected areas, and so they're not at risk of extirpation from Canada, but should be protected so that they don't become endangered. An example of this one, there aren't many from the prairies, but the Sable Island sweat bee is known from Sable Island off the east coast of Nova Scotia. And this bee is endemic to the island, and it meets threatened D2 because the square kilometers of the island is under 20 square kilometers. And due to climate change and storm and flooding events, the species is at risk, from this case, from extinction. But right now, it's okay because it's in a relatively, these storm events don't come along that often, but also because it's in a protected areas. Sable Island is now a Canadian national park. We're getting towards the end of these criteria. The last one is criteria E, and this is another criteria that you really need quantitative data for. And for arthropods, it's really hard. Again, we don't have these long-term data sets that can show declines or have support declines. However, we do have one species, the Gibson's big sand tiger beetle, that does meet threatened under the E criteria. And instead of using population, we used the spatial area of the sand dunes where the species occurs. And because of changes and threats to the sand dune ecosystems, mainly from invasive species encroachment, the probability the species will be extinct is 10% with 100 years. And it's through the work of some of the people who work on habitat changes in sand ecosystems that though their data was able to support this species assessment as threatened. So the quality, we've talked about endangered and threatened and extirpated, endangered and threatened criteria. Now I'll talk a little bit about the qualitative criteria. So there is a category of special concern, and these are for species that almost meet that endangered and threatened criteria, but their data isn't quite there, or they don't quite meet the thresholds. So these are species that are potentially really at risk, need some attention, but not quite at the status for meeting those quantitative criteria. And so the greenish white grasshopper is an example of one of those species. It has a specific host plant and it has a specific range, and there's a number of threats associated with the species, but it doesn't quite meet the criteria. There's other examples where a species qualifies for a threatened status, but there's a lot of rescue effect from outside populations. So this is especially relevant for birds. Birds, there's larger populations in the United States, and they routinely rescue the Canadian population. So a species qualifies for special concern because of that continuous rescue effect. Now, unfortunately, there are species that fall into the data deficient category, and the Wemia borer is an interesting story. So this species was originally assessed as endangered over 10 years ago, and it's because it was only known from a few sites in Canada. It was quite rare and rarely found. And it took some dedicated research by Kyle Johnson. He spent a lot of his time looking for the moth in various habitats. And in the first status assessment, the habitat associations were incorrect. So there was misinterpreted data or misinterpreted information in that report, and a lot of assumptions that weren't really based on science. So it's an example of a status report that there's a lot of conclusions that weren't well supported. And so the other challenge was that the host plant for the moth wasn't known. But in 2015, Kyle figured out that the host plant was bog buckbean. And he also figured out that the habitat where the species occurs are fens and peatlands with quaking mats, but also that the larvae for the moth like to live inside the stems. So it's really hard to notice the moth larva or the moths themselves because they don't live very long. So the overall detection was really challenging. But there were new records found in East Central Saskatchewan all the way to the Ottawa Valley in Ontario. And there's a lot of quaking fens and peatlands with quaking mats in that area. So although there was a number of new locations or new sites, for the species, the potential habitat out there is huge. And so the committee recently decided the species would fall into the data deficient category just because there's so many more sites that could be checked and so much more habitat out there. And these areas aren't highly threatened from development or logging or draining. There's a lot of habitat. And then, of course, there are some extirpated and extinct species too. There's a few examples of extirpated species, the island marble and the greater prairie chicken. Island marble is in BC. It's one of the species that I work on in my day job, and so that's why it's there. I think the last record in Canada was 1905, but it is known from the San Juan Islands, just south of the Canadian border. And then always hurts my heart when a species is proclaimed extinct, and an example of that from the prairies is the passenger pigeon, but there are numerous other ones across Canada too. And there's quite a bit of, it takes quite a bit of data or debate to suggest something's extinct. Often it's recommended as extirpated for a long time until there's data to support that it really is extinct. And for example, some whales are extinct and some birds, but for arthropods, it's a challenge. And one of the species that hasn't been seen in over 60 years is the island blue butterfly, which is endemic to Vancouver Island. But there's a lot of habitat that still could be checked. And so personally, I have hope the species isn't yet extinct, and it could remain in some of these other areas. And until all those areas, or most of them, are checked, it's not recommended to change status to extinct. Overall, when COSEWIC approaches species to be assessed, there's always the precautionary approach. So because there's not always huge data sets and information available to assess the species, in the absence of certainty, a species is always placed in the higher at-risk category. And this is just the precautionary approach, recognizing that a species could go in either direction, and it's better to be safe to ensure a species continues in Canada. And there's just some challenges. There's other species out there that could be declining, but there's very few data to support criteria. And my example there is the giant lacewing. This species is known from the BC to Ontario areas. It used to be in quite high numbers. It's disappeared almost entirely from Ontario, but it does show up a little more throughout British Columbia and the lower portions of the provinces to Ontario. But really it's a big, obvious, huge insect, and you think people would, it's very photogenic, so you certainly can take good photos of it, but it doesn't show up on iNaturalist or other social media sites where you think it would. Now, this is a larger, obvious arthropod, but there's lots of lesser known groups of arthropods, mosses, and lichens that don't get the attention because there just isn't the data. And especially those wide-ranging species that occur right across the country, there may be a lot of museum data to support their assessment, but often that museum data is old. It's the current data that we also need, so we can compare the timeframes. There's also species that occur in multiple habitats, and you can't quite figure out what the threat is, but you can see that it's declining. And then the historical trend data isn't there. Another huge challenge to this is georeference data. A lot of museum specimens and a lot of historical reports don't have reference data. It's a gazetted name that could be anywhere within a 20-kilometer radius around that gazetted name. Most important to species assessment is null search effort. And by that, I mean, we've looked and not recorded it. And it's not, null search effort is not exciting data to share with people. So I'm not surprised we don't have copious amounts of reports out there saying, hey, we went and looked for this, but we didn't find it. People want to share when they found it. So, but that null search effort data is very, very important too. So I'm getting to the end of my talk. Just some recommendations for people to contribute to COSEWIC and contribute to the assessment of species at risk in Canada. Post your photos on iNaturalist and other social media sites. Bug Guide, eBird, eFauna, all of these sites are just fabulous. And I just can't say more. I know many of you are super into iNaturalist, and I found personally, it's increased my ability to identify non-arthropod groups, or even arthropods. I can't identify them all. So it's a great learning process too. The deposit voucher specimens is more for people who work on scientific projects around arthropods. Voucher specimens of the when insects are killed, I think it's really important to deposit the vouchers or the bycatch or a subset of what you collect in museums so that researchers in the future can use that data. It's extremely valuable. Publish your natural history notes, publish your information, and by that in newsletters. It doesn't have to be in the journal Nature. It can be anywhere people will see fit to take your information. Photos, threats, search effort, habitat shots. And then again, I've got that on the bottom. Share your data. Examples are eBird, the conservation data centers, even with your friends. Share it. It's exciting. As well, if you have any suggestions for species that you think should be assessed by COSEWIC, you can email COSEWIC. You can write a status report. You can sign up for notifications by COSEWIC. You can bid on status report, apply for a subcommittee. All of these different ways I encourage people to do. You'd be surprised at how few people bid on status reports and how few people apply to specialist subcommittees. It actually took me 3 times to get on the subcommittee, and so I just persisted. I made myself known. I introduced myself to people, and I really wanted to be a part of it. And I got here. So I really encourage people to contribute in any way they can. And of course, I just have a number of people to thank as part of this, including Nature Regina for the invitation to talk to everyone today. So, and I should have put my own email up there, but anyways, feel free to email or contact me if you have questions.